Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being prompt. Welcome to the Engaging Your Team to Embrace Change webinar. I'll just give it a few seconds longer before we kick off. There's a few people joining, which is fantastic. So thank you guys for joining us. Thank you for jumping on promptly. Welcome to those others that have recently joined. All right. Thank you again. Thank you for joining. Welcome to the Engaging Your Team to Embrace Change webinar. I'm not going to delay it too long. I'm going to kick off on time. So let's start. I'm sure there'll be other people that are joining, well, still are joining as we talk, but thank you everybody for joining. We did have a successful webinar last week and we got quite a lot of positive comments, so we thought, why not run it again? So thank you to those of your colleagues who have invited you and for joining us today. So we're going to be talking a little bit about, well, a lot about engaging your team to embrace change through some strategies. So before I introduce our speakers, I'll just give you a quick overview on what we're going to go through today. So my name's Janet. I'm the solutions lead at Teamgage, and we're going to be talking about some techniques and concepts, exploring how we engage your teams to embrace change. So we're obviously all going through a lot of change at the moment, so we're going to look at acknowledging what people are going through. So some of the key things you're going to be learning today is about how to motivate your team to embrace change, obviously, how and why people behave the way they do when they are going through this change. And then we're going to talk about some simple techniques to engage your team through any change journey. So before I introduce you to our wonderful speakers, I just want to talk a little bit about how the webinar is going to run, and I'm sure by now lots of you are used to that. So we're going to be using the Q&A part of it, which you'll see a button on your webinar. So please use that and ask questions as we're going along. We really like it to be interactive, so don't be afraid to pop your questions in the Q&A and we'll answer those as we go. Also, you'll have a poll at some point in the early stages of the webinar. So it'd be great if as many of you as possible could jump on and operate the poll. There is an other field, so if you do tick the other field, please again, can you jump into the Q&A and just perhaps put a reason why you put other, or what your other reason could be. And then at the end of the presentation, within sort of 48 hours or so, you'll get an email which will include the slides, it will include a recording, it will include an invitation to the next webinar in the series. So after this one, we're going to be talking about bringing the tough conversations to the table. And you'll have an invitation to that. And also our lovely speakers, Aspen Solutions, are offering a 40-minute consultation to the people that joined the webinar. So it'll be really interesting if you want to jump on that opportunity as well. So let me introduce you to Leanne and Daniel. So Leanne and Daniel are the co-founders and directors of Aspen Solutions. So for those of you who haven't heard of Aspen, they are a boutique consultancy that works with organisations to help them go through change. So they have developed their own framework, so their change framework, which has 24 customisable tools and templates. So this is about coming in, listening to what you have to go through and tailoring something that's relevant for you. So just a little bit about Leanne, first of all. Leanne is very passionate about building resilience, agility and capability in people through times of change. And I just wanted to add a little fun bit as well. So Leanne is a fur mama to a rescue greyhound and a sneaker enthusiast. So Leanne, I'm really curious about that, and I'm sure some other people will be too. So we're talking about trainers or sneakers or however else you call them here. And then Daniel is an advocate for people development, effective leadership and mentoring. So Daniel has an extensive background in professional certifications around these topics that we're going to be talking about today. And a fun bit about Daniel, and again, you might want to explain this, Daniel. So for some of those on the call today, I had to look up what these were on Google. So Daniel is a lover of good coffee, which I'm sure most of you would be. I didn't have to look that part up. But also Stance socks and New Era 5950s. So I had no idea what those are. So I'm going to hand over to Leanne and Daniel to take you through the webinar and perhaps explain more about the sneaker enthusiasm and the new era 5950s. So over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Janet.
Thank you, Janet.
Yes, I firmly believe you can never have too many pairs of sneakers, and I wear them when I am walking my rescue greyhounds. So, yeah, big fan.
And the Stance socks. Stance is a brand of sock that comes out of the United States. Amazing socks, great quality, but just the artistic designs, etc., are second to none. Best socks I've ever owned, and I own way too many pairs. 5950s are a type of hat, baseball cap designed by a company called New Era out of the States, and they cover all of the sports. They have amazing different designs for different teams. I collect fitted caps, which makes it very hard and difficult and expensive, and I collect alternates of the main team, so I don't have the standard ones, so I make it very difficult for myself. But again, like Leanne, can never have too many socks or hats, so I get to wear my collections. So thank you for that, Janet. Appreciate that.
Great, thanks, Janet. And we're absolutely delighted to be here and partnering with Teamgage, and great to be back again after our webinar last week. So we're going to kick off, and we're going to start by asking you the question, what's keeping you up at night? So we all know that 2020 has thrown us a whole heap of unexpected and unprecedented change that we've all had to navigate. And largely, depending on where you are in the country and where you're joining us from today, you're at different stages of navigating our way through that unexpected change. And hopefully you're starting to come out the other end and starting to look at putting some of your previously planned and scheduled change initiatives back on the table. And so today we're going to look at how we can help you to do that with as little pain as possible. But we appreciate there might be some things keeping you up at night. So we are going to run a quick poll and just get some feedback. So we're going to ask you a few questions, and we just want you to let us know your thoughts. So firstly, are you suffering from change fatigue from so much activity? Now, this may be you personally, or it may be your people or your organisation. Is it that you've got conflicting focus of change projects? Now that we're putting them back on the table, we've got so many on the go at once. Where am I going to spend my time and attention? Are you trying to implement change whilst also navigating a new type of work landscape with people at home, in the office, perhaps a hybrid of both? That comes into, are you engaging a remote or a split workforce? What does that look like, and how is that impacting on your change? Or is there something else altogether? If so, let us know in the chat. So we're going to share with you now a quick poll and get your thoughts. So what's keeping you up at night? So if you just click one of those and hit submit, let's see what's taking place for you. Starting to see some votes coming through now, which is great. Okay.
Absolutely.
We'll give you a couple more seconds, and then we'll share the results. Great. Okay.
All right.
So let's have a look. Let's see where we're at. So change fatigue from so much activity is very much a clear winner there, 67%. And look, you're not alone. There's a good reason why that was the top one on the list, because that's certainly what we're hearing from a lot of our clients. But we also see there that conflicting focus, that navigating the new landscape, and also engaging your remote or split workforce. These are all challenges, and we hope that throughout the next sort of 40 odd minutes, we'll be able to give you some tips and strategies that might help you through some of these.
All right, so thank you for indulging us and helping us out with that, get some idea of where everyone's sitting. I guess the first question we probably need to ask is, why do we need to engage in the first place? And if we look at that, it's kind of, as this statement says, regardless of how great our product process system might be, if no one chooses to use it, it's really not worth much at all. So it's not worth a single cent if no one chooses to use it. So the only way that organizational change works is individual adoption. So that's what we need to do, to have people individually choose to actually adopt the change. We need to have a look from a personal perspective. What are the personal implications, are people's perceptions, maybe their possible fears of what's actually causing them not to want to do that? That way we get to engage them on an individual level, and then we can provide the support they need to go through navigating this change. Good change management. It allows employees to understand and then commit to and adopt and embrace our changes if done correctly. And now there's a number of different changes. And as Leanne said, the start of 2020, we've seen a lot of curveballs thrown we didn't expect. So we've got a lot of locational changes, if you like, and technology changes, but we can also have structural or procedural, we could have leadership changes, whatever that might look like. So on top of everything else, there's a massive gamut of landscape of changes that we're all indulged in at the moment. What we want to look at though is successful and sustained change. And those two elements are really important, both that we want it to be successful, we also want it to be sustained though. And the only way we do that is when our people are confident enough to step into the arena of change and actually be able to navigate through it with the tools, processes and skill sets to be able to do that. The reason being is this. As the second part of this statement will say in a moment, $1 million investment will be worth nothing if those who need to choose not to adopt it. So that's where we talk about the fact that individual adoption is the only way that successful organisation will change actually occurs. Now, to do that, this is what we suggest. Hopefully every organisation out there, everyone watching, whoever you work for has a successful or at least has a change management framework of some description that they're subscribed to. Now, there's a lot of them out there. They look at very much individually different pieces, etc. They're all fundamentally the same of a change process. What you're looking at here is the Aspen change framework that we've created. And as we said right at the front, and thank you, Janet, there's 24 customizable tools and templates to run you through this. So it's really based on 4 simple processes here of define, develop, deliver, and then direction. So if we break that down really quickly, define means setting a solid foundation and identifying the vision and the capability and the players that are going to be part of this change that we're going into. The develop piece talks about creating and then executing your change management plans for a project or whatever initiative you're going through. The deliver piece, this is where we start to assess and then reinforce the change as we implement it. Because what we're looking to do is create a successful new BAU or business as usual. We want to go from the old to the new and make that the way we travel. The last part's direction. When we talk about direction, we're talking about ensuring that there's really good governance across our change landscape and the process we go through. We want to make sure that the change program is identified with key learnings and also successes out of that for our ongoing changes as well. As I said, there's a number of different change frameworks out there. We're not saying you have to subscribe to the Aspen change framework. I just hope your organisation actually has some form of change framework and they actually put it in place and you adhere to the process. That's the most important part. So that sets up, I guess, a strategy and a foundation for that. Something else I really want to touch on before we get too far in is creating that foundation for change. And one of the biggest elements right up front when we're starting to look at implementing a change is this, our sponsor and coalition contribution. The reason I put this up front is anytime there's a brand new change, it needs to have that support right from the top for everyone in the organisation to buy into it. Now, for the past 20 years, active and visible executive sponsorship has been the #1 listed contributor to successful change. That's what drives this. And as you can see by the dot points here, it's that active and visible executive sponsorship is the #1 key you need from this. Sponsors also need to be able to create a coalition of leaders. And what I mean by that is you need to have someone who's influential enough and has the backing and buy-in from all of the leadership group. The last thing you want is, and we've probably all been there, I know I have, in an organisation where you have pockets of resistance. And that can be led by leaders who are so-so or actively or, I guess, behind closed doors, actually opposing the change. And if you have that, what you find is that will feed through into their people and you have these pockets of resistance. So your sponsor needs to be influential enough to create that coalition for the ongoing success of change. And lastly, the one point I'd say is, if you don't have a dedicated change manager in your organisation on these change projects, I absolutely suggest getting one. I couldn't encourage that more, because they will be able to guide and assist the sponsor and the coalition of how to actually manage that change successfully. 4 real quick pieces on that, as it says here. Sponsor takes a lead in building and maintaining a healthy coalition of leaders who can support that change. Employees want to hear about the change from two key people in the organisation. That's a direct manager and a leader at the top. Let me break that down for you really quickly. If we are talking about how my day-to-day functions and duties change, that needs to come from my direct manager because they're in the trenches with me. They understand what I do day to day and those functionalities. If we're talking about how do we see the organisation changing and what that change process looks like, that needs to come right from the top because we're talking about the vision or the idea of where we're taking the organisation. That has to come from your sponsor and your executive leadership team. So there's some difference in that, and we'll talk about the communication piece a bit later. So an effective sponsor also legitimizes the need for change, and they become the preferred sender of those comms that talked about the need for change. And a really key point that they need to address here is the risk of not changing. Quite often we talk about the things we're going to change and what we're going to do. We don't talk about what the risk is if we stay the same today. So that's a big key piece too. Lastly, active and visible participation from that sponsor is required across your entire change journey. You need to have insurance of consistency of your messaging. Too often what we'll see is executive sponsors be at the start of a change, and they'll come out and they'll talk about it and they'll launch it and they'll have a lot of sort of enthusiasm for it. And then, they have conflicting priorities or directional changes or other things come up, and maybe they can't be as involved in it, or they abdicate that responsibility to someone else on their behalf. Once we start watering down their buy-in to this change, we start to water down our people's buy-in as well. So it's really important that executive sponsorship is maintained throughout the entire process. When we talk about that, though, we're talking about the change that our people go through. So let's see what effect that actually has on our people.
So let me share with you the Kubler-Ross change curve. So this came from one by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she was a Swiss psychiatrist who in 1969 wrote a book called Death and Dying, which sounds a little bit grim, but the Kubler-Ross curve was originally designed around talking about the different stages of grief. But over time, it was actually recognised that we go through this similar curve and similar cycle when we're simply going through change, either in our life or in our business. And so this model was adapted for business purposes, and it became the Kubler-Ross change curve. So the grief curve is still very much in use today, but this is really when we're looking at change within business. And this actually talks about the emotion that we actually go through, and all of us do this, and we all go through change at this curve from time to time. Sometimes it can be really quick and seamless and we go through it in the matter of minutes. Sometimes that can be a lot longer process depending on what the change is and the significance to us. So this here talks a little bit about what are the things we go through and also what we can do to address that. So the first one we start here is with shock. Often we hear an announcement about a change that's coming and we're a little bit shocked or surprised. We don't see that coming. That can quickly move us into denial. Hang on, I don't know about this. This is the first I'm hearing. I don't know why we're doing this. And we start looking for evidence that this isn't true. That can often, once we actually realize that, whoa, hang on, this is happening, we can quickly start to slip down now into frustration. So we're starting to accept and recognize that things are going to be different, and we don't necessarily like that. We might be angry, we might be frustrated, and we're starting to actually have a series of emotions start to come up for us. If we take that a little bit further, we can actually start to then move down into depression. So this is where we start to get a bit of a low mood, we're lacking energy, we're feeling a little bit resigned. I don't want this change, I don't know what this means. And people can sometimes get stuck at this point. And so it's really detrimental to our organisations if we leave people sitting here. So we need to have some strategies to be able to move through and move people through the curve to experiment. We're starting to dip our toe in the water and have a bit of an initial engagement with whatever this change is or whatever the new way looks. And hopefully we'll then make a decision. We're starting to learn how to work in this new situation and perhaps starting to feel a little bit more positive about that. And we made the decision to then move to integration, where the changes actually are integrated and become part of the new way forward. It's really important to note that people can swing back and forth. It is not necessarily linear. And as I said, people can move through this at different speeds. And you might have the same team of people going through the same change, and they'll all navigate this in different ways and different times. What we love about this particular change curve is if you look to the side, we've actually got some strategies that we can do at different parts. So if we look at denial, this is where it's really important, if we look at this legend down the side here, that we create alignment. Why are we actually doing this? What does this change mean? And how the fact that it actually impacts everyone. We start to see that we're actually not alone, that it's not just me. This is part of a bigger change, and we're all in this together. So creating alignment is a really key point there. When we start to see people moving into frustration or anger, and we're starting to see some of that emotion come up, it's when it's really time to maximize communication, particularly if in the absence of information, people will make up their own stories. So it's really important that we want to actually give them all the facts and make sure that they know exactly what this means. As we move into depression and experiment, this is really important when we actually need to build capability. This is where people need to know, well, what does this look like? What does this mean? How am I going to do this thing? And once we build capability, that's when we start to see experiment. And when we move into decision, this is where we start to share our knowledge. And at this point, it's really important that those people who are starting to pick this up, they become your change advocates. So they can start sharing what they've learned with others and help them to move through the curve. And it's also about really celebrating and recognizing the wins at this point. So if we don't help people to navigate, this is what, that if we don't help people through this, we'll find that people can sit in the bottom and not necessarily move through. And the goal is always to get people through this as quickly as possible. So this talks about our people. But what about for us as leaders? What do we need to do? So we've got some building blocks for successful change. And this is all about helping our people to...
Brilliant. Can I just jump in there?
Yes, absolutely.
A few comments and questions coming through. So when we're talking about sponsor and coalition, so there was a good comment around sometimes the key sponsor or the executive that we want on board and we want to engage kind of trusts other teams or other areas to go ahead with that. And even though there's some really so much positivity there, how do we actually engage that person? Because they still need to be the sponsor, they still need to be the person that's driving it. So I think that's some of the questions that are coming through, which you may get onto a little bit later. But I think, how do we really connect with some of these sponsors that are trusting other divisions to move forward with it? So yeah, thank you, James, for that one. And then we had some comments about this Kubler-Ross change curve, which I think one of them was something I felt when I first saw this, a really good connection between the grief curve and this curve. And I don't know whether people have put that together before, and we talk about change, but I don't think we realise always the impact that change can have. And as we liken it to grief, I think that's really powerful. So yes, that came through as well. It was a real eye-opener for people. So there's a couple of comments there. I don't know whether you want to add on to that.
Right. Thank you, Jenna. And look, it can be, to some degree, depending on the change, it can be a process of grief. If suddenly a part of my role or part of my function that I've always done and I've always loved is being taken away from me through maybe digitalization, and part of my job is now being automated and I'm losing, there's an element of loss or a sense of grief that can come with that. If a structure change means that I'm now reporting to a different leader, but I've got a great relationship with this leader, absolutely there can be similarities to grief as people go through change. So that's a really great pickup. And that's why it's important to recognize that change does impact on our people, and we need to recognize that. The sponsor piece is an interesting one, and we could actually run an entire webinar just on the importance of sponsorship. Daniel, I don't know if you want to quickly touch on that one.
Just really briefly, it's a really it's a common one you get. Sometimes the ideal person that would be there, that would be able to champion this cause for you and be able to do and say the right things. And as I said, sometimes they are that person because they have so many conflicting deadlines, because they're so stretched thin that they need to put other people in place to do that. It's really tough. The only thing I can suggest is understand the importance of the change and really put how important is the change and the success of that change to the ongoing success of the business, and try to highlight the idea of where does their priority need to be around the success of this change, because they are clearly probably going to have 101 things that they're involved in and responsible for to do. it's about understanding what priority does this change take. And sometimes we need to look at us and go, I know I want to push this change through, but am I overemphasizing the priority of this change as well? I know that's hard to believe, that what we want isn't the most important thing. Sometimes we need to be aware of that. However, it is really about understanding what is the priority for this change to be successful, for the ongoing success of the business, and then finding ways to highlight and demonstrate that to the sponsor. And that comes back to that point I made earlier, the risk of not changing. And sometimes if you can highlight the risk to that sponsor, if you're not involved, we may not get this change across. If we don't get the change happening, we are in danger of X, Y, and Z. So it's about building your case around that. As Leanne said, could do an entire webinar just on that piece. For that reason, I'm going to have to leave it there, but please, throw some questions or whatever in the Q&A section. You'll have our details at the end. Feel free to get in contact with us, and we can talk at length about that if you want.
Happy to have a chat with you if sponsorship is a bit of an issue in your organisation.
The only other thing I'd say about this version of the Kubler-Ross change curve, as Leanne said, the legend on the side gives you attainable and achievable functionality of what you can do at each point to work people through that, because some people will never get through that process, and that's something we need to be aware of as well. So. But as Leanne said, that's what our people go through. What do we as leaders need to be able to demonstrate to help them through that? That's the next part we're on to here.
So as leaders, there's some building blocks that you can implement to help to support successful change. And what we know is that people look around them to influence their beliefs and actions. So they're going to be looking to you as their leader, to that coalition, to the sponsor, to see certain behaviours and those around them in their own teams. So there's some things that you can do. First one's role modelling. So I'll change my behaviour and mindset if I see my leaders, staff, colleagues and staff behaving differently. So really important, that coalition and that sponsor, you've got to be walking the walk, because people look to that. Fostering that understanding and conviction. So this is, I understand what's being asked of me and it makes sense. So we need to, it comes back to creating that alignment of telling people why it's occurring. If I understand why and it makes sense to me, I'm more inclined to get on board. It's not just enough though to do that. We also need to have systems, structures and processes in place to support the change. Without that, people aren't actually going to get on board. And the final is actually developing their talent and skills. So they need to have the skills and opportunities to behave in the new way. So why do these things work? Firstly, we know that those around us influence our beliefs and actions. We know that emotions are contagious, and if people are being negative and not on board, that's going to permeate. If people are on board and engaged, we're going to see more of that. Full awareness of a change equals a desire to want to adopt it. It's important to both set and reinforce the desired way. So we need to tell people, but we also need to continue to reinforce. And believe it or not, it is actually possible to teach an old dog new tricks. And we've been in plenty of organisations where there are staff who've been there for a really long time. And I know the belief is, oh, those people are never going to change. The reality is we have neural pathways in our brains that we build over time when we do the same thing over and over again. By simply trying and starting a new way, each time we do that, we create a new neural pathway, and it is possible for us to learn new tasks, no matter how old we are.
And that sort of goes back to that Kubler-Ross piece around developing that capability of that sort of that depression piece into that experiment piece, where it is possible to teach an old dog new tricks. As we build capability, people start to go, oh, I can give that a crack, I can try that. Oh, that worked. What else can I do? And they start to believe the concept that you can teach an old dog new tricks. To do that and support us, though, there's some really important tools and frameworks out there. One that I love because it makes a lot of sense and works to help people create change plans is this. It's a model called ADKAR. If anyone's been involved in change even slightly, they'll probably know what ADKAR is. It's based on the methodology of an organisation called ProSci, which is a lot of my background in methodology. I love ADKAR because it is very simple in its premise and actually covers the entire change journey really, really well. ADKAR, the name, is not based on some wonderful Greek mythological name. It's literally just an anagram of 5 words and steps through the process. So, and it's very similar as you go back to look at those building blocks and the Kubler-Ross of what we actually need to do. And the first one we keep talking about is this, which is awareness. When we put change in place, we're asking people to step outside of their comfort zone, and that's scary. It's tough. It's hard. It's fearful to do that. You know, if we're doing that, what we need to do to be able to provide them support and I guess reassurance is we need to articulate the why. Why is this important to the organization? Why do we need to be involved in it? Why do we need to change? And more importantly, why do I need to be involved? And that goes back to that, what's the risk if we don't as well? The second one, and for me, this is the most important part, and I will harp on this a little bit later as well, is the one called desire. As it says, understanding the need for change and then wanting the change to happen are two different things. So we can know that it's the right thing to do, but if it means I've got to do work and I've got to change and I'm going to lose some of those things, I'm going to have the relationships or the process and all of that stuff I've had before, maybe I don't want to be involved in that. We need to create alignment to create desire. And that's alignment around how do I individually tap into someone and go, what are your values, beliefs, ideas, what's important to you, and how do we create alignment with the vision of where we're taking the organization? If you can create the alignment where it leans into someone's personal values and beliefs, you actually get most of the job's already done to get that individual adoption I talked about earlier. So that's great. We can make people aware of that, of what we need to and why, and we can get them to start to really want to be involved. Unless we give them this piece, which is the knowledge of how to do it, it kind of falls on deaf ears, because it's one thing to want to be able to do it if we don't know how. There's no point trying to implement change unless people whose jobs are changing know how to get things done. Now that literally is giving them the skills, the knowledge, the idea of how to do the new way properly. That could be a process, it could be a system, it could be whatever that might be. What do I need to know how to do the new job? So what we're talking about here, it's about teaching them how. Now that can be classroom training, it can just be a knowledge pack, it can be information, but it all rolls up into teaching them how to do the new way. The next part after that means we've done the theoretical of teaching them, we actually need the practical of being able to apply this. So how do we build ability? Because knowing how to do something doesn't necessarily mean you know how to put it into practice. I can learn it in a classroom. Can I actually do it when I go to do it in real life? In my new world, in my new role, whatever that looks like, can I put that in place? It's important to actually build people's confidence in this, because this is where we can try, and if we try once and it fails, I'm out, I'm done, I'm not involved. However, if we can get people to keep trying, even if it's a setback at the start, we keep building that ability piece through that and the proficiency, what we need to do is remember that ability is built over time. So we need to get them on board and continue that process. So once we've done that, we've taught them, they know what it is, we've got them to want to do it, we've given them the tools, yes, they can do it. As an organization, the next piece is this, it's reinforcement. Reinforcement is incredibly important because, as I said earlier, the only way organizational change happens is individual adoption. So if people choose not to stay on board with this and they go back to the old ways because it's quicker, it's easier, it's more simple, it means we don't get the return on the investment of what our change was there in the first place. So with this, it's important to make sure we create the new BAU and make this happen, but it's also important to look at areas where the new process maybe isn't serving you or can even demotivate your staff, because you need to keep on top of that to make sure that we are actually making this change become the new BAU. Now, these are 5 steps. There's a lot of different, there's actually 5 plans around this of how you actually create this to work. It's part of the ADCAR piece, which rolls up into a bigger change framework. For me, though, it's a really important piece for us as organizational leaders to be able to implement through a change process. So why is it all important, and how do we actually get this happening? So how do we make this work? You heard me say just a little bit earlier, and I'll say it again, for me, it's the biggest part of change that people overlook, they misunderstand, or they just don't really look to implement properly. The number one element necessary for change, for any change movement, is individual adoption. For me, this is where I come back to that piece called desire. The desire piece for me is the most important part. If you can tap into someone's desire, it will take care of so much other work around those other areas, because they'll want to actually be part of it. That's the hardest part. The number one element necessary for individual adoption is desire. I keep harping on that because, you know, when we ask people to change, it creates anxiety and fear, and that's naturally what we call resistance. If someone asks to do something different, we as human beings are wired to go, yeah, not too sure, I'm comfortable where I am. So we need to make sure we can take away the uncertainty of that fear of the unknown, create desire to get people to lean into that. So I mentioned the word resistance, and that is a huge piece of change management. So what does that look like?
I'm just going to jump in again, sorry. We just had some comments there. A couple of people recognise that ADCAR model is a really great model that makes sense, and great that to have the steps to work through. So yes, thank you for that.
Absolutely.
You will get a copy of the slides after. So if you didn't manage to get a photo or a screenshot that, don't worry, we're going to send this out to you after.
And the reality is, if you want to, I highly encourage Google ADCAR. You'll get a huge amount of information about it. It's nothing that's secret. It's not secret sort of change management business. It's out there and open to the public. I absolutely encourage everyone to learn as much as they can about it.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you, Daniel and Janet. So back to me. So what does resistance to change look like? It might look a little bit like this guy going, oh, I don't know about that. So look, resistance can show up in a number of ways in our people, and sometimes it's not always obvious and it's not always overt. Sometimes we'll see behaviours and won't actually realise what's sitting behind that. So there's a few things, a few keys that you can, if you see some of these behaviours start to come out, might be some warning signs or some red flags that people are resistant. And then we'll give you some strategies. So emotion, people can express that a number of ways. We've already seen the change curve. So that can be things like fear. We understand that the biggest fear in workplaces today is the fear of irrelevance. So if a change is coming in, what does that mean for me? Am I still going to be relevant and needed? So that creates a lot of emotion. There can be loss, sadness, anger, frustration. So we can see that coming out. Acting out is something we'll also see. That might be things like conflict, arguments. Sabotage is a big one. People can become overbearing. They can even become a bit passive aggressive. So you'll see them in a meeting and they'll be like, yep, I'm on board. And then they'll walk out and say in the corridor, hell no, I'm not on board at all. So you'll start to see perhaps some acting out. Negativity. So this is things like excuses, counter approaches. Oh, instead of doing that, why don't we do this instead? You'll start to sometimes see those, the vocal minority will start to gather a bit of a posse, the silent we. There can be secrecy and a breakdown in trust. People can also start putting up barriers. We can also see things like rumours, gossip and miscommunication coming out. So what else does it look like? Well, it also looks like this, disengagement. So this is where you'll start to see silence, avoidance. People will actually ignore comms and instructions. So you've sent something out, you've told them, and they'll just deliberately ignore them. You may see apathy. Work can be impacted. So that's things like reduced productivity and efficiency, non-compliance, absenteeism, and mistakes. Avoidance, that's ignoring the change and reverting back to old behaviours, putting in place workarounds. Yeah, don't worry, I'm just going to sneak around the back door and do it my way anyway. And controlling. This can show up in people asking a lot of questions, wanting to influence the outcome, and defending the current state. Another one we see in controlling can actually be using status. So this is where if you do not have that coalition of leaders, you might have one person on the leadership team saying to their area, don't worry about that, we're going to do it our way. These are all things we might see. And they can really undermine your ability to get your change successfully implemented and sustained.
So that's where it's, like Dan said, that concept of getting that stakeholder, that coalition, creating that desire piece and having that through, because all of this stuff is what we see play out when we roll through that Kubler-Ross change as well.
Absolutely. So what can we do to manage it? There's a number of strategies to manage resistance. And this is, again, something we could run a whole webinar just on this. So if you do want to talk to us more, please jump in and jump on the phone or grab a meeting with us and we're happy to have a chat. But here's our top 4 favourites. So the first one is simply listen and understand the objections. So this is actually a critical step. So in many cases, people simply want to be heard and just voice their objections or ask their questions. So understanding objections can often provide a clear path towards resolution because we understand what it is that people are concerned about.
Just on that, I mentioned before the concept of resistance, and often resistance gets a really dirty sort of black mark against it. it can actually be used as a really good tool, because if we get up front really early and understand what someone's resistance is, we can actually take steps to alleviate that, and we can actually use that in positive ways to actually move forward through the process. So resistance shouldn't be looked as a bad thing. It's a really key to understand, to build, as it says, create that desire piece.
Exactly. And that's why this is strategies to manage resistance, not necessarily overcome it, because as Daniel said, it's not necessarily a negative thing. So focus, this is about focus on the what and let go of the how. So for some type of changes, and it can't occur for all of them, it's effective to let go of how we're going to do that and simply communicate what needs to change. So this is really about focusing on the outcome. What it does is, when we actually just talk about this is what needs to be changed, we actually invite people to be part of that, and they can actually help to create what the how looks like.
Yeah.
And that's when you'll get buy-in. It's not possible for all change, but if you can, and you can give people an opportunity to be part of the how, you'll get great buy-in that way. Removing barriers. So this is actually identifying the root cause for an individual. And this is where we need to listen to understand the objection. So if you've got somebody, an individual, understanding what is the barrier for them, and that may be a range of things like family, personal reasons, physical limitations, or the capability to be able to do the new way.
Mm-hmm.
It might be money. They might be, making this change might impact their hours and therefore their ability to earn overtime or penalty shifts. Understand what's the barrier and see if you can work with that person to overcome it. You may not always be able to, but you might be able to find ways to eliminate some of them.
Sometimes with that as well, it's about really understanding your people on an individual level, because sometimes what is actually the barrier can also be a blind spot to them. They may not even technically understand what the barrier is. They're just not going to buy into it because there's something that isn't right about that for them. So it's understanding on an individual level, what is it that's the barrier, and bringing that to the front for them sometimes, and then looking at what can the organisation do to actually start to remove that barrier, because that buys a huge amount of buy-in as well.
It does, thank you. And the last one is provide simple, clear choices and consequences. So choice can drive desire, so be very clear about this. Sometimes the reality is the change is going to happen regardless of whether we like it or not. And so be clear about what the consequences are. If we don't change, we may not be in business in 2 years' time. If you do not adapt to this new way of doing your job, you may not have a job. So as hard as that can be, sometimes when people are clear about the consequences, it makes it much easier for them to make a choice. And this is about communicating in simple and clear terms what the choices and consequences are for each person, because you then put ownership and control back onto them to actually decide whether they're going to opt into that or not.
And that's a really good point, that last point, because when we're talking about clear choices and consequences, it's individual choices. It's the choice of actually making the change successful for the organisation. Will the organisation be here for me to have a role in? Do I actually want to opt into this? Maybe I don't see that. So my choice is either opt in, okay, or maybe this organisation is no longer for me, and that's okay as well. And as leaders, we need to be able to manage that process and support people, whether they're here through the change or moving on from the change. So there's some strategies to manage that resistance.
Janet, do we have a question? Is there a...
Yep, I thought that was the case.
Thank you very much for that. So so this goes back to when you were talking about resistance, Leanne, there's sort of that element of reinforcement and confirmation. And there's some comments there about that's useful if applied across the 4 ADKAR elements as well, which I think there's a really good alignment there about different parts of it and how we can connect the two. I'll read the other one as well, and then you might want to make some comments back. And then there's another comment around the listen and understand part of this slide that we're looking at now. A lot of agreement coming through on that one. And Joe's mentioned about a good dose of empathy can make all the difference. And I know Joe is very strong with empathy. So thank you for making those comments, Joe. Certainly, if we can connect with our people, listening and understanding, it's got to make a difference. So, yeah.
That's a really key point. And again, we could run an entire webinar on empathy. Because you're absolutely right. It is particularly when we're listening and understanding, and when we're trying to remove barriers, understand that these things are real to those individuals. So being able to sit and listen with empathy and not brush over that, because what they're going through is real for them. And so to be able to do that with empathy and compassion is absolutely vital. So great call out, Joe. Thank you very much.
Look, I couldn't say that anymore, but that call out right there is exactly what my background is. My background was a really strong change management background with organizational changes, structures and processes in place, and that was amazing. The one part that was always lacking for me was how do I individually connect with someone to create that desire piece I talk about. Hence the reason Leanne and myself are both emotional intelligence assessors and practitioners as well. And that was my next piece, was to get the emotional intelligence understanding to be able to utilize that while going through change to actually connect individually to understand what is that desire piece for people. How do we overcome that resistance? What is that impact having to them? So that is an amazing call out. That's absolutely the way that we structure our change framework. So thank you for that.
Joe, you could run this webinar for us. Well done. Thank you.
Perfect. Was that all, Janet?
Yes, for now. Yep. Keep the comments coming though, guys. That's really good.
So that's the strategies to manage resistance we talked about. So here we've talked about this a number of times, creating the alignment piece and how do we get desire. Communication is key. What and how we communicate dictates the desire we generate and ultimately influences our people's choice to adopt change. And you hear me ad nauseum going on about individual adoption is what successful organizational change is all about. I can't stress that enough, but this is how and why. So what does it actually look like? How do we successfully communicate and how do we look at that? Here's a really quick, simple framework to look at for that. Focus on what they care about and what they need to know. Those are the important things. 4 real keys around that. It means the right messages coming at the right time in the right format from the right sender. So it's about what messages need to go out when. Get out the front nice and early as soon as you can about a change to give as much information to create that awareness, the right messages at the right time, right at the start. When people start to go through that Kubler-Ross and they have the shock, the denial, all that, let's get the right time of our messaging out there. What stages of the change do we need to continue that process? The right format. Email is not always king. I cannot stress that enough. Unfortunately, the way we work these days, email is such a convenient thing that we do all the time, but to convey the right messages at the right time, that is not always the best format. So it's about how we go through that, whether that's stand-up town hall type meetings, if you can, webinars, whether it's recorded messages from the right sender, that 4th point. As I said, 2 major keys. If we're talking about the direction of the organization and why the change has to happen for our overall success of everyone, it's got to come right from the top, that executive sponsorship. If we're talking about I'm on the front line and I do the day-to-day grind and my role is going to change, what parts of my job and my role are going to change, that needs to come from my direct manager. They need to be engaged through that process, through hopefully, this is again where I say get a good change manager who can tell you where and what has to happen. But these are 4 elements. What do they care about? What do they need to know? The intent is around that. The outcome is obviously to create that desire piece through communication.
So we've got a couple of the last few points we want to make on communication. There are a couple of, I guess, some key strategies of successful communication. First one, more communication, more of it. Communicate to more people, more often, and to all levels of the organisation. And it should be targeted, more face-to-face, more interactive, and more relevant to your audience, so as Daniel's just said. Make sure you actually have a communication strategy, because sometimes we actually forget about that and we kind of do it on the fly, but actually planning that out in advance, including succinct, consistent, and an accurate set of core messages. So what is the core message we want to get right through this entire change journey? Communicate earlier. We cannot stress this enough. Even though you can't necessarily tell everybody everything all the time, as soon as you can, start to communicate. And consider syncing your communication in with your current networks. If you know that you have monthly team meetings or weekly, Zoom calls, or you have an intranet with a newsletter, just tap into all of your existing communication channels and actually make sure that something about your changes is tapped into all of those networks. And if possible, don't have a dedicated resource working on communication, because do not underestimate the amount of time and energy and effort that this can take if it's done properly. And so often it's just kind of left to one side, but having a dedicated resource or knowing that person who's going to be coordinating all of our comms is really important. And so if done correctly, communication will form a major and a strategic part of your overall change success. And it's going to affect areas such as how supported your people feel and their well-being as they go through the change. And that's where we'd probably like to hand over to Janet now to actually talk a little bit about how that communication does impact.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that. There's a couple of comments that have come through first before I start to expand on that. Edwina's mentioned about tone, and I think that's a really important comment. So she said that tone is incredibly important in change communications too. And I think that comes down to how we're communicating as well as what the tone is. So face-to-face, sometimes it's easier to work out tone. So Edwina's mentioned about face-to-face and email, whereas sometimes that tone in an email can be misconstrued a little bit. So I think that's a really important comment and certainly adds on to what you were saying earlier.
We've all received those emails where we've gone, sorry, what are you saying?
That's right.
The tone in that written form is really difficult. So that's where, if you can, use a video.
Yeah.
Have somebody record a video where that tone can come through and embed that into an email or put that onto your intranet and then send the link out.
Correct.
Because you're right, tone can certainly be misread in
Yeah, that's a great point, the video actually. And then we have another comment there. Interesting, this is about just thinking aloud. So select and develop some change coaches. And I think this is where we're talking about that buy-in and that sponsor as well from a higher level, but maybe some change coaches at all levels. So select and develop some change coaches, including the change plan that can be helpful throughout the change process. So I think, again, the more people we can get involved with this to help people through is fantastic. It's that support again, isn't it?
Those change champions, identify those who have desire and have bought in and get them to help be those champions and to help spread the message. Absolutely.
There's a number of different strategies around that, and one of them is get those change champions in. There's also a piece around get those who aren't necessarily on board, because as we talked about earlier, if you can engage them in that process, here's the outcome. You develop the how. We're going to let us as a change team, we're going to let go of the how. You're going to be engaged in that as someone going through the changes to do the how, so it can actually start to change some of the centers around as well. So again, huge topic, could talk for a long time around that exact point right there. Going to leave it at that because in the interest of time. Again, great comments. I really appreciate that coming through. All make a lot of sense. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you, everyone. So when we were talking to Leanne and Daniel, I thought from a Teamgage perspective, it wasn't going to be too hard to see some correlation around the points that they were talking about. So we looked at the correlation between communication and support, and exactly what Leanne just said earlier. We looked across almost 2,500 submissions across Teamgage organisations or organisations using Teamgage, and it wasn't difficult to soon see that if communication dropped, people didn't feel supported. So that, again, how do we communicate? We communicate more, we communicate in different ways, we communicate according to our target audience, and that's where we'll see people feeling so much more supported. And I think more interestingly around wellbeing has been a huge thing that people have been looking at the moment with the change around diverse workforces and things like that. So very easy to see on here. And again, this is logical. This is not something that's rocket science. We can almost predict that this is going to happen. But from looking at the data that we had, again, across organisations and many submissions, we can see here that if communication drops, well-being is going to drop. People don't feel looked after. They wonder what's happening with them. Stress comes on board, again, through that change curve in particular. So, but the most important thing I wanted to share with you, the next slide talks about a real success story that we've been part of. Now, I'm not naming the organisation here, but this is one large organisation. So you can see with their results around different metrics that they're looking at, round about the time that COVID hit, there was a drop in most of their metrics, except for communication sort of plateaued. So what happened with this organisation, there was an opt-in to salary reduction. Obviously, everyone's talking about, how we stay in business, what do we need to do? And trust dropped rapidly, as you can see there. So what they decided is that they needed to up communication. So that was one of their first strategies. And they talked about various ways of communication. So how do they make it more personalised? How do they make it more real for the people that are out there? How do they communicate not only from executive downwards, but also through lines of business? So, they set up various strategies, which again, Leanne, was what you were talking about before. How do we communicate more? How do we make it relevant? So they had various forms of communication, and you can see that the metrics or the results started to increase and trust again built quite quickly. And then of course there's another round of what do we do next? COVID's still going on. Oh my goodness, what's next? So there was another round of things like redundancies and opt-in. So you can see again the trust plateaus, but communication, you know, we keep going, and again that trust builds up again. So all sorts of things that this organisation put in place. Some of the things were like face-to-face chatter through Teams. There was a platform around communication with Q&A. There was the formal like stand-up meetings were happening more regularly. There was a tactical response group that was set up for the technical side of it to make sure people had all the technical equipment and the the facial recognition. But more importantly, I think, and this comes down to that communication piece, is that the leaders were much more transparent. They were much more authentic and real. Everyone's going through this. So how can we be vulnerable? How can we be human? How can we talk about what's important with this business right now? And I think that's what gets people on board. So as soon as there was that authenticity coming through from leaders at all levels, and they were prepared to say, you know, hit me with all these questions. We're going to have these town halls. We're going to have these various meetings, and you can ask us anything and we will be completely honest. And again, you can see how the communication and the trust, and of course the other metrics do increase. So I thought that was a really useful success story to talk about and link into what you've been saying.
This is a great story, and all of the data that you've shared with us, Janet, is just reinforces one, how vital communication is on trust, on support and well-being of our people, particularly through times of change. Yeah. But what we particularly love working with organisations who are going through change, you know, we have our framework where we can give them tools and templates and resources, but coupled with the Teamgage solution to be able to measure in real time how are people feeling, and to be able to see and actually put strategies into place in real time to address some of these concerns. Yeah. Is one of the greatest tools we have available to be able to go through change. And there's a story right there that talks about that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, you know, we often know this logically, but I think, you know, when we can measure it and see it and talk about it and put actions in place, it makes such a difference. And thank you, Emma, you've confirmed that as well. You know, great success story. Authenticity and vulnerability is so important to our leaders, in our leaders, excuse me, and it is. So yeah, thank you.
Totally agree. And look, to Leanne's point, you know, the Teamgage tool and technology there, to be able to recognise that in real time, but also to be able to gain the ideas and suggestions from your people, and then be able to create the situation of how do we now act on what you've brought to us as a leadership group is invaluable. And it really has that buy-in and that desire piece that we've talked about the whole way through. So again, it's a real credit to Teamgage in the manner in which they go about that. Guys, in the interest of time, I'm going to leave you with one more thing. And for me, it's kind of a gift with purchase. I really love this. I sucked at algebraic equations when I was at high school. Although I did maths at a relatively high level for a while, I dipped out because I couldn't do it at that point. But this is almost like an algebraic equation for how do we get complex change to work. If I follow this equation, it will work. If I have the vision, if we have the skills, the incentives, the resources, and an action plan in place, I'm going to get success. If I lose one of these elements, on the right-hand side, you can see what the significant risk is to my change and what I'm likely to get instead. So if we have a dedicated vision and have our executive sponsorship team being able to talk about that and have our people buy into that, if we create the skill sets for our people to be able to do the new way, if we provide incentives, and that can be reward recognition, it can be what does this mean down the track for my job succession? Where can I go from here in development? It can be financial. Just bear in mind, financial rewards are not the best for change. For a small, short impetus they are, but it's generally as soon as the financial part's taken away, so is my care or desire to want to be part of it. So be careful with that. The resources, do I have the structure? Do I have the organisation? Has the organisation put around me a situation and environment that allows me to do all this new stuff? And lastly, is that action plan robust? Does it have a framework? Do we have a change model in place? All of those things. I often generally, if I run workshops, will give this out and say to people, have this sitting on your desk, and next time someone comes through and says, we're about to put this brand new wonderful change in, it's going to do all these things, I ask them, just hand them this and go, can you just make sure you can tick off all these things and show me where this is? Because if you can't, you're not ready to implement that change or even embark on it yet. So gift with purchase, take that away, guys. As I said, This is called the noster model for complex change. I really love this as a change agent myself. But with that in mind, if you've enjoyed today, please take the time to note this down. Our next webinar, as Janet said at the start, is bringing the tough conversations to the table. That'll be on the 5th of November. That's an interesting one in itself. An hour is going to be hard to keep everything within that because there's a lot to get through. How do we have those conversations? How do we instill the confidence in our people to be able to do that? How do we as ourselves be able to set ourselves up to have those conversations as well? So looking forward to that. Hope you've enjoyed today and will join us for that as well.
So some of the topics that people have raised today around empathy, around authentic leadership and transparency, these are all going to be part of bringing the tough conversations to the table.
Absolutely. And lastly, if you want to, please get in touch. Janet from Teamgage, thank you again, Janet, for being part of this and hosting this and allowing us to work with you for this process. We love it. And obviously there's our details from Aspen Solutions at the bottom there. Please take them down. As we say, if you've enjoyed today, please join us for the next one. If you've got more questions, please throw them out there. If we didn't get to answer them, we've got commentary or whatever, get in contact with Janet or ourselves. We'd love to have a chat to you at some point about any of this.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you too. We've got lots of great comments coming through, lots of thanks coming through, lots about the models. So again, thank you, Leanne and Daniel. It's been really great working with you on this. This is part of a series. So again, jump on that next webinar around bringing the tough conversations to the table. It really ties in with what we've been talking about here. So yes, thank you again. I look forward to the next one, and we finished on time. So that's great. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you. Where's the, I guess, more. And